Well, happy Tuesday, everyone. It has rolled around again, Ramin. I'm Dr. Laurie Davis, your host of the Today Show. And on Tuesday, we discuss business, politics, money matters, current events. How are you doing in California today, Ramin?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. It's a beautiful day, and yes, it's good to be here.
Well, we're getting a little controversial, but one of my favorite new friends, Tony McKegney, called me a week or so ago and he said, Laurie, maybe Ramin and you would do a show on the tariffs. And I thought that was a brilliant idea. And as a matter of fact, I thought it was so brilliant. I said, Tony, if we're going to do that, you have to be on the show. So we'll be welcoming him here shortly in a few minutes after you get a chance to do your intro. So over to you, Ramin, to start us off today on Money Matters on Tuesdays. Over to you.
Excellent. Yes. So this is a very timely subject. I'm glad you mentioned it because it's in the minds of not just Americans, but globally, everybody is paying attention to this. And it's not the first time. This has been going on for hundreds of years, but it is very intense because of all the information technology. So everybody's on it, affecting, again, many nations. So let me open with this. So some of the topics we're going to talk about is what does Napoleon's height and COVID and Nike's story and the dollar have to do with tariffs? So I'll start with that. So what we'll do is then we'll have a little journey on the history of tariffs when they actually, is this something new or have we had this? And then we discuss pros and cons, and that's where, I would like to hear Tony's, his input as someone who's living in a very interesting area, and that he will have a nice input. So
why don't I, excuse me for interrupting, why don't I bring Tony in so he can listen with us and be here live to hear your opening remarks, and then we'll get into our discussion.
Okay.
He got knocked out, but when he comes back in, I'll just pop him up. Okay?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you go ahead.
Awesome. So let me start with Napoleon. Now, Laurie, when you hear about Napoleon, what is the first thing usually it comes to mind as far as?
Well, he was a soldier and he wasn't a very big man, and he, Bonaparte's retreat kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, there's actually, well, we have Napoleon complex. Everybody, as a leader of, this one of the strongest armies, he was said that he was very short in stature. And as I said, there's a Napoleon complex, how people talk about that, or you want to compensate for something. Believe it or not, actually Napoleon, although he was 5'2", that was French measurement. And in English or British measurements, he would have been about 5'6.5", 5'7", which those days it was actually above average heights in France and in Britain. But British used that to their advantage because they used that 5'2" to politicize things. And the reason I mention that is because what happens, a lot of times the media and our education system, our history, what happens is it's a lot of times they do set up the things that we follow these based on what we are told. Another thing, you hear about vomitorium, in the vomitorium, it's been said that, in ancient Rome's, they would have these special rooms after all these major parties and, the leaders, then they would go and vomit so they could have second eatings. And has nothing to do with vomitorium is swinging out in Latin. And it was all those entrances in the Colosseum when the people come in and going out. So the problem is the impressions we get from the history, it stays with us because it's been repeated. So a lot of false information. And it brings me to where the media is today. I remember when I was growing up, education system, the press, and the politicians where the trust was. I want to be a politician. I always, listen. You go back to uh, World War II, the journalists. Then you come back and Walter Cronkite and all the other, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And there's not a lot of trust nowadays because things have become opinionated rather than facts. And the same thing about our education system. Our education system has had their own agenda, and unfortunately, that's not leading the way. So let me talk about tariffs, and we talk about imports and exports. Let me share, this is a true story about Nike. And a few years ago, the government confiscated 600,000 Nike shoes. And the people who were, they said they couldn't understand because they had done everything perfectly. The reason they were confiscated, because on the Nike, it said made in USA. And the government says there is no Nike shoes built made in USA. It should have said made in China. So here is an American icon, American company, and that shows the globalization of what we have gone through, especially starting in 2002. That's when China joined the World Trade Organization, which was December 11th, 2001. And things really changed because we had this globalization mentality, and that how it affected the consumers and the cost of everything. And that brings us to COVID. I mentioned, what does COVID have to do? And of course, as you know, we really shut down the world. And if you go back, you see that COVID was the rise of nationalism and populism and anti-globalism. So when you look at all the elections around the globe, that was one of the inflection points that for 16, 18, 20 years, we've been this globalization mentality, which has helped the consumers, and we've gone back. So the other thing I have to say is you have to remember with ideas, and I can't wait to hear, Tony's, his input on these things. When we talk about economy is not a science. You can put 100 economists in a room and they will not agree on things. It's not like mathematics. It's not like physics. Mathematics is almost like absolute science. So economy is more of an art and interpretation than science. So that's why what we could do, we have to look at things in pros and cons. And depending on the environment that we are in, we will see, are the tariffs good? Are the tariffs bad? So it's not an absolute answer on that one. And basically, because of that, in order for us to understand how the markets are reacting and is it good, is when you have to use tools. And one of the best tools you can use is the currencies. Currency of each nation is the bloodstream of that nation. And that's what gives us a clue whether the markets are favorable or not. So having said that, I'll start just for our audience to explain what is tariffs. So hopefully we get that clarity so we know where we're coming from and what we're talking about. Basically, tariffs are taxes that impose on imported goods. And they are the tools that the government uses in order to influence the trade policy. They want to protect their domestic industries, and they want to generate revenues. And those are the things you hear from Trump. So basically, President-elect Trump. So basically, this is the tools that have been around for thousands of years. When we look at the history of tariffs, we have to look at basically going back to Roman Empire, and we look at ancient Egypt. They actually had started putting taxes on important things. How about Silk Road? The, when you were coming from Orient, from China, coming to Europe, all the nations in the middle, which are Central Asian, it's almost like a toll road, right? So when you go to a toll, you have to pay toll. That's what they were using it. And then in medieval Europe, they would do that. And then we come to 16th and 18th century, and we look at that time they called them mercantilists. And mercantilist was like Great Britain, we had France, we had Spain. All of those, they decided they want to protect their own industries, and they would put taxes on anything that they were importing. So, for instance, that was even in navigations, they wanted to keep their own, again, economy intact. Until 19th century, all of a sudden we have this industrial revolution, and of course it starts in Great Britain, and they see, this is great. This is a time we want to export things because things are really becoming efficient. All of a sudden, Britain says, you know what? Let's stop these tariffs. Let's, because they want their goods outside their country. So basically, that's when we see the shift. And then the 20th century happens, and we've had, when we go back to, if you recall, one of the worst times are in history, it was the Great Depression. And one of the culprits, everybody talks about the banks, talks about the stock market crash, 1929 crash. Really, the worsening thing which happened, and it wasn't Herbert Hoover as president, it was the Congress who started the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which happened in June 17, 1930. Unemployment was about 9% when the crash happened. After putting those tariffs on, all of a sudden, the unemployment goes to double digits. And we did not recover from that till end of World War II. It was really, it, it, historians disagree or agree, is about, Franklin Roosevelt's social program. That really didn't help that. The end of the whole thing was the World War II. And World War II really ignited the recovery and all, otherwise, even the social programs, which were many that President did, it really didn't help. But the tariffs really ruined the country, the protectionism. And this protectionism has been till after the 1947, then the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trades, which is GATT, started coming to the picture. And all of a sudden, the Europeans, they got together and said, well, let's minimize this, and we don't want to have tariffs. And then, of course, we come to the modern era, which is 21st century. China comes into the picture, and all of a sudden, now we have this openness, that the competition. And one of the best things in any economy is competition. And that's what you could see all of a sudden. Walmart of the world becomes 70% importer of Chinese goods, and that's why you can find a lot of cheap stuff. So those are the little history on that. So the last thing I have to say about this, and then we can talk about pros and cons, and I would like to bring Tony into this, is I want you to think about where the tariffs are positive and they're negative. So, of course, a lot of times, a lot of economists, and I'm a open market, free market investor. I go back, one of the best books ever written is Wealth of Nation by Adam Smith, which was in March of 1776. And he is not a fan of protectionism except in two events or two um, conditions. Number one, when there is a national security involved. And the second thing is about being fair. So I talking about fairness. I just finished at this, so maybe we can take a break and then we can start this.
Mhm.
So, of course, you have been. I just finished with this in networking. We all have been in the networkings. I know I would give businesses away. I will for referrals. I had like attorneys come to me. Ramin, you have clients. So a lot of times, all of a sudden, you refer people left and right, but nobody refers back to you. They are great in taking things, but nobody is willing to give things. So you give one referral, two, five, 10, 20, and you called. In my case, I'm calling attorney. Well, how's it going? Oh, great. Thank you very much for all the referrals. But no referrals coming back my way. So I want you to look at tariffs the same way. A lot of times in this situation, like China has received a lot of favorable treatments. They are by far, they have the biggest balance surplus, $823 billion, while the United States has the biggest deficit, close to $2 trillion. So what happens is that fairness. And that's what the tariffs do. Tariffs say, listen, we give you this in return, we want this in return. So I want to give that in our audience's mind, just to look at both sides. As an investor and trader, I don't have biases. We go in, the market is right. So when I'm investing, I don't say, well, because I have this emotional attachment, I'm not going to invest today. No, markets tell me. So you have to be, unbiased. And that's what we use the dollar to tell us in this situation, what is Canadian dollars doing? What is Mexican pesos doing? To tell us how the market is thinking. Are the tariffs good? Are they going to inflationary? We look at the long-term bonds, treasuries to see what they can tell us. I leave it at that. I hope I've opened some doors for our audience to think about things. And then I think we need to take a break.
Yeah.
First.
Introducing Veteran House Alliance International Monthly 50/50 Raffle. Purchase your ticket today, link on display, and have a chance to win cash and help a great platform supporting veterans.
Well, thank you very much for that. And our little brake pad isn't functioning at the moment, so we're going to just take a little time to introduce Tony to our audience. And Tony, I have you on mute when we're talking, so we don't have that feedback. So I'll just flip that on and off, and that'll be a solution to that little situation. So just excited to have Tony on the show today. I met Tony a while ago. We had him as a guest on the press box, Doug Smith and I. And he and I have been in touch ever since. And we text and we phone. And he's had a little health challenge, and I had a little health challenge. And we kind of worked our way through that. So he's becoming a good friend. And he brought this up to me. And I thought, wow, this is a terrific idea. And maybe we'll start by just asking Tony why you decided to suggest that for a show. Welcome to the show, Tony.
Yeah, how are you? And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, good. Yeah, is the sound level okay for you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the reason that I thought about the fact that I live on a border city with Canada, and I grew up in a border city with the United States as well. And I just thought of a funny memory. One of my teachers, when I was 15 years old in grade 10 in Canada, brought up the notion of this tariff situation, and nobody raised their hand in the class. And he was my favorite teacher. He was a very smart guy. And he said, well, what do you think of the people in other countries in the world are feeling about these tariffs? And nobody raised their hand with an answer to anything. And I just raised my hand and I said, I think everyone is terrified. And he was a really good guy, and he got it. And sort of half the class sort of got it. And I just came to me that this notion of terrified. This is 1973. And you brought up a good point, Laurie, the other day I was thinking about the different trade ventures between Canada and U.S. and living on the borders for most of my life. And you brought up the thing about oil. And my dad was one of the head chemical engineers at Imperial Oil in Sarnia, Ontario, and ended up helping to invent ethanol. And at the time, he went to Texas back and forth with Standard Oil and the other oil companies that were in the United States that they partnered with. And they ended up creating ethanol. And I just started to think about the relationships that we have with Canada and the United States. And, you know, we fought in 2 wars together. My grandfather was in the First World War, volunteered in the Second World War, died there, 1945, as a volunteer, as a Canadian citizen. My father and 4 uncles and an aunt fought for the Canadian side. So, you know, we're next door. I'm 1 mile from Canada, where I live in the United States. And basically, you know, we've had so many years of friendships and so on and so forth. And when I see us grouped in with the tariff situation, and again, the exchange rate, which has been alluded to between the 2 countries, and the fact that this lumber thing and produce and the amount of cars that are built in Canada, Ford particularly, that are shipped to the United States. And again, with my friend reminded me that owns a Ford dealership about the parts that are made in China that are shipped to the United States and then assembled here. And, you know, I just really strongly feel about the relationship between the 2 countries because we're side by side. And I don't know much about Mexico other than the fact that in the 70s when I started going to California, most of the people that were doing yard work were Mexican immigrants. And then 5 years later, I came back to Los Angeles, California, playing against the Kings in hockey. And those same persons were owning their own companies and driving their own trucks. And that's how it sort of, you know, came to be. And then the produce thing, as far as the produce that's made in Canada, United States, soybean comes up as a huge exporter of goods, and lumber coming from Canada to the United States is huge. And I just think that we're such a good trading partner for that to be affected in any way in going forward, because we are side by each. You know, we're neighbors. And I don't compare us to Mexico, United States. I just think about Canada and being such a great trading partner that we've been for a lot of years. And when I see 5,000 people coming to a hockey game from Canada to the U.S. and helping a franchise that's based in a border city, which is Buffalo, New York, that's Canada helping a U.S. Company, if you will, the hockey team. So I don't know, I truly believe strongly in the relationship between Canada and the United States.
Well, Tony, I think that is such a great perspective because I'm a Canadian and I lived in, you know, the East Coast. And my ancestors, my grandparents and my dad's parents, who are one and the same, they traveled back and forth across the border to work. Our uncles would go down to cut lumber in Maine. Then they'd go down and pick blueberries. Then they bring them back. I mean, there was like a free, you know, you didn't even need anything to travel back and forth. And so we've gone from there to now. And I believe that whole concept of the relationship between the 2 countries has always been extremely not divided, but tight. So we're seeing that division for sure. And I think COVID had a lot to do with that too. Ramin, your thoughts on that in terms of the relationship, because you brought up the word fairness. And to me, that sings loudly and clearly about the relationship. So being fair. So what are your thoughts on that? And then maybe back to Tony. I have you muted, Tony.
Question for Raheem.
Yes.
How do you think the exchange rate, and you alluded a little bit to that, being at, say, 30%, thereabouts, Canada, US, how does that affect people with the trade and tariffs and so forth, going back and forth between Canada and the United States? Because if you throw 25% on top of what typically is 30% thereabouts, I guess, in exchange, how does that affect the Canadian and U.S. Tariff if you've got 30% on the table, which maybe has helped over the course of years, with the American dollar being $1.32? How does that affect if you were to throw 25% on top of that? And Laurie had alluded to the oil situation with the pipelines and so forth. But I mean, how does the exchange rate affect a tariff on top of, you know what I mean? Sort of, that's the question I have.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Oh, that's a great opening, Tony, what you just mentioned about the relationship between Canada and United States. And so I'm going to do two parts. I'll speak on that, and then we look at the currencies and interest rates, how they affect, especially with the currencies, which is a byproduct of inflation and interest rates. Those are the two main things which dictate the value of any currency. So first of all, I lived in New England, and I was a Boston Bruins fan. So I would go to Montreal, anytime I had a chance, because we love to go to Forum, and they would come. And so I have quite few friends in California who are actually the Canadian nationals, believe it or not. I have Iranian friends who went to school in Saskatoon and in Edmonton and in Toronto. So there's a very close relationship. So when you talk to any American, when you think about Canadian, sometimes they mix it up because there's a lot of Canadian actors and comedians. Everybody believes that, they are American. Well, they're not. They're Canadians. So it is a lot of, like you mentioned, World War II, even Persian Gulf. And then, after that, they've been this harmony together. So basically what has happened, I believe, with again, I'm just watching from the outside. In the last few years, the way that in this case, President-elect Trump's looking is more emphasis on immigration, and with Prime Minister Trudeau's his whole philosophy with open borders, even a lot of immigrants coming in. And this, in my opinion, is more of a negotiating tool. I don't believe there would be a 25% tariffs on Canadian, because we also need Canadian nickel, cobalt. We have natural resources, uranium. I mean, there's a lot of relationship that we need from Canada. So I think the idea is this is more on the Mexican side, that they are really bringing Canada in. We had the NAFTA, for instance, and the idea is to show that, listen, we are serious, and the whole thing that, when Prime Minister Trudeau flew over, that tells you something is happening. And I think it's going to work for both countries in many ways. So I don't believe this is going to be implemented, at least with Canada, because there's a lot of relationships. But I think with the drug situation and immigration, that was the main reason. It has nothing to do with Canadian, obviously population and anything against Canadians. Because as you said, there's a very close relationships with people of Canada and United States. Mexico is completely different. Mexico, you have from Latin America, a lot of people are moving from, we look at the Guatemala and then even the Nicaragua and El Salvador and all the way from Venezuela. So it's a different negotiations when you have 10, 12 million people are crossing, which is completely different than Canadian borders. That's something that they're going to take it seriously. One of the suggestions was you don't even have to have tariffs if Americans and Canadians don't go. It's a, it's a number one tourist destination. So if people just for 1 year don't go to Mexico, that's going to just completely shut. They don't even need tariffs. So those are some of the ideas. And China is another story. Although the things have moved from China to Vietnam, we look at Sri Lanka, Indonesia. So things are moving from manufacturing side to, like, Vietnam has become China of China. And China has its own problems right now, and they're really working on consumerism. They need to have internal consumers to really get their own economy going. But they still got $800+ billion. One danger that, President like Trump has to watch for, all these countries that they have been exporting to us, where their money is? The money is sitting in our treasuries. It is in dollar. So if we can push this too far, if there was a chance that the money will be moving away, well, then that would be a big effect on the currency and also the economy. So that's something, and interest rates. So the second question, the second comment I will make about currencies. What happens, the currencies, as I mentioned, it's a byproduct of interest rates and inflation. And we call them parity. So the two countries have to really, they have to have the same purchasing power. So what happens in the United States, if you go back, since the end of September, the interest rates have been really going up, and it has taken the dollar up with it. Consequently, has pressured other currencies, specifically Canadian dollar and Mexican peso. Chinese yuan is very low right now because they have their own economic problems. But what happens, the reason that the interest rate went up or the treasury bonds came down, because when you're looking at interest rates on the treasuries, let's say 30-year bonds, we are looking at few years end of the road, and we see, would inflation play a role? Because if I'm lending you money, for instance, I say, okay, Dr. Laurie, I'm going to lend you money. And you say, well, how much you charging? I say 5%. But if I'm going to have inflation 5 years down the road and my money is not going to worth as much, that 5% is not enough. So I got to add that inflation to it. So that's the reason when there is a concern about inflation, interest rates go up. When interest rates go up, the country who has a higher interest rate usually attracts the money. If you compare United States interest rates to Europe, Great Britain, and in Canada, United States has a higher interest rate. So because it attracts the money. When you attract the money, supply and demand, the currency goes up. So a few weeks before the election, the markets were telling us that Trump will be elected, because you could see that the interest rates are going up or the bonds are coming down and currency is going up, Bitcoin is going up. So that was the fear of inflation due to tariffs, because one of the biggest byproducts of tariffs, at least in the short run, is inflation, because consumers have to pay. Who's paying those taxes? Walmart buys, let's say, a dry cleaner or whatever, it's from China, or washing machine. Well, that washing machine has 10% or 20% tariff on it. Well, it's Walmart who's paying that. So they're not going to be responsible for that. So they turn around and say to consumers, well, here is 10, 20% extra. So basically, the consumers have to pay higher prices, And that's one of the short-term negative effects of inflation and for the consumers, because competition is the main thing about keeping the prices competitive. So when you kill that, that affects. In the long run, what Trump's idea is, well, it will create some taxes, revenues, and he wants to give tax cuts, for instance, internally. One of the things is, again, the fairness he's talking about, mainly with China and Mexico. And also he's thinking domestic employment. But when you talk about domestic employment, usually there are specific industries like steel industry or auto industry. It doesn't affect everyone. So basically, if the consumers are paying higher price, is generally the whole population. So it only affects certain industries when you have tariffs.
We welcome you to advertise and promote your goods and services, and or brand your logo to 34 million subscribers on Canada Talks 167. Your investment will go towards our employment programs in the media industry for persons with disabilities and veterans.
One thing tariffs do and sanctions do, and I've seen it because it's looking, they create self-sufficiency. So it's the positive side of the countries that have been hitting hard, and they have to become innovative and they have to do something on their own. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, because if you don't have the parts, like a country like Iran, after the revolution, there's a lot of sanctions. So they have their airplane parts are the parts that they had during Shah. So for the last 40 years, either they have to smuggle things in or it's very, unsafe sometimes. So they had to create their own, which is not as good as outside, but some big things have affected them and they cannot replace that. So I don't know if that answers your question. So consequently, when the dollar goes up, it affects the opposite, which is a Canadian dollar. Now, the stock market has done well in the last 2 months in Canada. It's really going along with the United States, but the currency has come down because also Canada has its own internal political problem. There's a lack of confidence in the government, which is affecting the Canadian dollar as well. So now you have a strength of the dollar plus a little weakness from the trust in the Canadian dollar. So that's the reason the two forces have brought the Canadian dollar down. So I don't know if it's helpful, Tony.
I was going to chime in. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. A little
Yeah.
louder, Tony. Just a little louder.
Well, good. Anyway, I was going to say that to give you a real quick comparison of, again, I mentioned I live 1 mile from Canada.
Wow.
There's a home, if you will, on the water, and I relate to that because, the waterfront, and a house that is valued at, say, $500,000. On the American side, if you went 1 mile across the border, that same house is valued at $1 million on the Canadian side. And it's 1 mile, it's the same view, it's the same everything, same size house, everything. My friend owns 6 Tim Hortons franchises in the area of Hamilton. In fact, he owns the first Tim Hortons that were built in Canada, which is in Hamilton, Ontario. And somebody working at the counter there makes $31 an hour. The same person working in Buffalo, New York makes $14 an hour doing the same job. So the person in Canada is making 31 bucks an hour at Tim Hortons to afford to live there. And that's just a comparison on just wages. A gallon of gas, if you compute the difference, which people complain about here in the United States, about paying $3.25 for a gallon of gas, 1 mile from here, with the conversion rate and so forth, the same gallon of gas costs $7 for the same thing in Ontario, Canada, which is 1 mile away. And I try to explain to people how expensive it is to live in Toronto, Ontario, living there. And now people are moving to Niagara Falls, St. Catharines, Fort Erie, Ontario, because they're working jobs and they can't afford to live in Toronto, Ontario. And there's people from China and places, this is my friend's way up in RBC, he knows about it, in Toronto. And they're basically buying condos and with no thought of ever moving to Toronto, just to the fact that when they buy something residentially, it goes up 10% a year. So it's a great investment in a place like Toronto, Ontario. So that's the market comparison between Buffalo, New York, and Ontario, Canada. It's very different as far as the cost of living.
No, that's a great observation. Of course, Toronto, I mean, it's one of the most expensive. The real estate has really gone up now. With the interest rates resets, that could affect probably some of the real estate in Canada. Some people have variable rates, but going back to what you said, yes, there's that the inefficiency. That brings me to, again, just a little story I'll share with you. We call them the chicken war. In late 1950s, Germans loved American chicken. They could not have enough chicken. So they started importing chicken in 1959. And by 1962, they were importing $50 million, which is about $500 million in today's dollars, from the United States. The farmers are happy in the United States. They're, oh, great. Well, the European farmers, they said, wait a minute. And now we have the European Union. Why are you going to America? So they decided to put tariffs on American chickens. So Germans were forced to buy chickens from Europe. Well, United States in 1962 decided, wait a minute, well, you're putting taxes or tariffs on our chickens. We're going to put, what are we importing? The Volkswagen, the minivans. I don't know if you remember those famous minivans in the 60s. So they put tariffs on that, which really shut down the Volkswagen. And believe it or not, even to this day, there is tariffs on Volkswagen minivans, and that's why you don't see a lot of them in the United States. So these things, sometimes they last without any adjustments. The same thing in the first term of, President Trump, he put tariffs on steel in China, for instance. And that actually stayed, and President Biden renewed it. Now the question of semiconductors. So we have to separate the fairness and also the effects of it is inflationary, because the competition is very healthy, and I am an open market. So I'm not a big advocate of tariffs. In my opinion, I go back, I think this is more of a negotiating tool, getting people into table. I mean, come back and let's talk about things, rather than actually, I don't foresee that there will be a 25% taxes on Canadian imports, for instance. That's my opinion. The other thing, which I will be interested, you're living in the borderline, there's a lot of talk about the drugs and fentanyl, and coming from Mexico especially, but also China, and coming some from Canada. I like to see, do you see that, living or is that a big thing? Because we do see that coming from Mexico, obviously, with the cartels. And, Mexico is one of the least secure, safe places in the world to live in, because of all that. But Canada, of course, is not. But do you see that playing effect? Because that's one of his criteria for this.
I'm in on that. Like marijuana was coming across the border from Mexico in the 1960s, and maybe before that, to places like California, and then eventually, I went to high school, and it was just called Mexican when people were smoking marijuana, and then something else came along. It was called Colombian marijuana, which was more expensive than Mexican. And then these things came from Thailand called Thai sticks. And this is when I was 1972, 73, going to high school. And then there was something called Acapulco Gold that came on the scene. And then there was Hawaiian. So all these marijuana things came across the board. And they came from Michigan, where I live, because it was again, Detroit's a big city. And there were a lot of drugs there. And they came across the border because of the proximity. It was very simple. And that's what was going on in 1972. And I guess the fentanyl thing, which I don't know a lot about it, other than the fact that it's very inexpensive to buy, and it gets mixed in with other drugs and so forth, and is lethal. And I guess in a lot of cases it is, because it's cheap to buy, I guess. Crystal meth or whatever it is very inexpensive for anybody to buy on the market. There's about 5 vape shops within probably, I don't know, 6 blocks of where I live. And these places, anytime I drive by them, people are just parking with their 4-way flashers on and running in, running out. And it's crazy how busy these places are, that people are whatever they're buying there. Thriving business. They're opening up all over the place, type thing. But I'll tell you something about, I've got a few black friends that I know that own some restaurants. And they grew up, ironically, playing hockey. And one of the kids played CFL football in, I think, BC or something. And I asked him about a year ago, thereabouts. I said, well, what about a female president? And the black guys I asked the question to said that black people, men, would not vote for a black woman because they don't want a black woman to have that kind of power. And I'm just thinking, oh, okay, wow, that's very interesting. And then I talked to a friend of mine in Detroit who's a white Jewish person a few months ago. And he just said the vote will come down to a white versus black thing in this country. And that's what he told me. Both attitudes and things that I heard turned out to be true in what happened, in essence.
The Disability Channel would like to thank our existing sponsors. We really appreciate the support and kindness from the BIAs across the GTA, Ontario, Canada, and our friends in the USA. We love making new friends. Thank you for supporting our existing employment programs.
And it was surprising to me that the attitude that a black female, and obviously black, which I mentioned, would assemble some sort of power over anything. And, you know, that's what I was hearing from talking to black people about who they're going to vote for.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So I have a question, Tony, for you also. You're a former NHL hockey player. And of course, most of our hockey players are either on one side of the border or the other, back and forth, back and forth. And I'm not sure what this has to do with tariffs, but at the same time, how did that work? You know, when you were in the States, you earned American money. When you were playing in Canada, did you earn Canadian money? How did that work for you there?
And the exchange rate was 50 cents on the dollar. It was extremely good to be making American money, for sure. And the tax rates were, like, say, playing in a place like Quebec province. And I'll just give you an example. If you're making $350,000 back in the 80s, you paid 55% in tax. And my accountant figured out that if I were to file a U.S. tax form, living in Florida, having a home there, and living in Buffalo, New York, I saved 27% on taxes. just by basically filing a U.S. tax return, and then with the Canadian tax return, if you will. So that was the advantage. And then when the exchange rate got to be even, or thereabouts, back in, I'm trying to think of like 2001, making U.S. dollars, and then being in Canada, so it sort of fluctuated, where you picked up 50%, and when the dollar was even, it just sort of changed that way. And I think now, with the NHL, everybody is paid in U.S. dollars, whether you're playing in Vancouver or whether you're playing in Los Angeles. It's across the board. It's U.S. money. That's how it works now. So for the Canadian teams at one point, because their salary structure was such that whatever the payroll is, $80 million, or to throw out a figure, if you add 30% to that, you have to add, I guess, 30% to the cost of tickets, maybe, to go to a game in Toronto versus going to a game in Buffalo, New York, which is a big difference in the cost of tickets. In saying that, and a lot of people do come from Canada to Buffalo because the ticket prices, for a ticket that would cost you perhaps $350 in Toronto for a hockey game, you could get into a game in Buffalo for $50 to $60 to $70, $80.
Wow.
By driving an hour from Burlington, Ontario. So there is a big difference, and you're seeing the same sort of product. The games are a little bit more expensive when Toronto comes to town, or Montreal, as we alluded to before about growing up in New England. Boston, New York Rangers might be a higher price ticket, so they sort of adjust it as to who the team is they're playing. If San Jose's coming in on a Monday, you can get a ticket for $50 to go to the hockey game.
Wow.
Yeah, so there is a differential in that, and as I said, with the exchange rate, it does factor in, and I just think about that when we talk about the tariffs and the trade and so forth. Does Ford, the fact that Ford is making all these trucks in Oakville, Ontario, in Lambeth, Ontario, and Windsor, Ontario, when they sell trucks in the United States, does 30% make a difference to the guys buying these trucks in USA? 30% in the dollar, and it's the same truck they could build in Detroit, Michigan, but does 30% make a difference on American dealers buying those trucks from Canada? Do they save 30%? I guess. And if you added a tariff onto that from Canada coming to here, would 25% would it just become 25% more to sell that truck in the USA? And again, the person that's buying that truck in the United States, are they just paying the 25% on top of what would be normally the other price? If you add 25% tariff in there, same thing if something's coming from Mexico. I feel bad for the farmers when they talk about the farming situation with soybean and so forth. If they were to lose on soybeans coming from Brazil or some other place, or produce, I feel bad for the farmers that are located in the United States. I feel bad for those guys that live here and pay taxes here and depend on that. And if a tariff gets thrown on this produce, I guess eventually they lose out. I guess.
Thank you, Tony. Lots of great things for us to be thinking about, guys. And look, our time is up already. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Tony, so much for joining Ramin and I today. And Ramin, was it fun to have a guest? Over to you.
Well, we could have another hour or day or
Yeah.
so. Just a quick thing, Tony, that was a great observation about, I'm glad because it's not just NHL, you have, NBA, and we have Major League Baseball, we have Major League Soccer. there's a lot of teams that have commingled with Canadian teams, so it applies to them. Just a note, you mentioned about the difference of the tickets when the Toronto comes. Messi, who is not the greatest player right now, when he joined Inter Miami in Miami, every game that he was playing, the tickets prices were 10 times. I mean, if he comes to LA, if the ticket is $80, all of a sudden it becomes $800 just because Messi is coming to town. It's not even about the team. It's about just one person. The problem was there's a lot of few games that he was injured. So people paid all that money, wanted to see Messi. Unfortunately, he didn't even play. So, but that was a good observation about the difference of the pricing and the team. So it was an absolute pleasure, Tony. Thank you so much. It's great to get the perspective from both sides that you are really living right in the middle of it. So, but I think this conversation will definitely continue, at least for the next 3 or 4 months, because I don't think we'll have the closure, but I'm optimistic. So I think there's a lot of negotiating going on behind the scenes. And one of the things is obviously like China want to build a large factory in Mexico. Now they're rethinking it. So like Toyota and Mercedes and BMW, they built a lot of, auto manufacturers in Alabama's of the world, North Carolina, South Carolina. So they're just putting some incentives there. But anyway, I'm optimistic person. So I'll.
Tony has something to say here.
I said, can China build a wall there?
You're funny. Thank you, gentlemen. It's been a real pleasure. And yes, Tony, we'd love to have you back again. And thank you, Ramin, for all of the great history and the information. And just to mention to our viewers, we are streaming live right now on my personal Facebook page, Laurie Davis. We're also streaming live on our YouTube channels, Laurie Davis Show Host. You can go into YouTube, Laurie Davis Show Host, just do that search, and there we will be. And Tony, you can share the show with your friends and colleagues and people that you know on the New York side of the border and anywhere else in the world that you want to. And thanks again for the great idea for a show. And that's another thing that I really appreciated was oftentimes we do shows because we think we know what needs to be talked about. But if you have a topic that you'd like us to do a show about, just do like Tony did, call me and tell me, and here we are. We'll be back tomorrow. We have a special guest. We're doing a 3-part series on gang life. So Ramin and I started that last week. What constitutes a gang? We all have gangs in our communities. And tomorrow we actually have a special guest coming in, a friend of mine who was a former gang member. And he's going to talk to us about how he got out of that and still struggling as well to get out of there. He's out of the gang, but then, of course, there's all the aftermath. So we'll be welcoming Dustin Garriosh tomorrow as our guest. So bye for now, and we'll see you guys later.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Driving down the interstate, got a load that can't be late, gotta get it there by 9. Went up ahead in front of me, I can't believe what I see, people standing in a line. They say they're against violence, but what they're doing makes no sense, keeping me from my drop, blocking everyone till the demands are met and done. This insanity has got to stop. Hey, hey. Socialism, communism, white power, nationalism, and Antifa and the BLM. They like to tell you what to think, how to live, what to speak, but rules don't apply to them. They say they're only doing good, yet burning down neighborhoods. There's just no respect. Trying to make the world go woke, I think think it's all a big joke. I'm politically incorrect. Politicians always say they're working for us every day. They got their hand on our last dime. Lockdowns, handouts, prices rising all about, while people turning their lives to crime. Liberal DAs letting criminals out today, no jail or punishment. At the end of the day, the innocent seem to pay, thanks to Brandon and our government. Defund police, abolish ICE, liberals pushing this advice. There's no law and order. BP and state police told to process and release illegals at the border. Immigration, invasion, nothing on the news station. What did you expect? I guess coming to the USA and doing it the legal way is now politically incorrect. Musicians, actors, athletes, the media, and fake news, giving their opinion like it's a religion, thinking we don't have a clue. Mean tweets, fact checks, boys and girls changing sex. To this I must object. We need hard-working, bill-paying, God-fearing, and people praying. Become politically incorrect.